Hello, welcome to Farmgate, the world's #1 food security podcast. I'm Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. Well, it's a gloomy day in Dorset, but in this conversation, I'm travelling to Scotland to find out more about their farm policy landscape and how it balances nature integration with farm activity and food security. The first nature-friendly farming summit took place in Scotland last week at Dynamic Earth in Edinburgh, just across from the Scottish Parliament. The theme was farming for nature, profit and public good, and my guests today each took part in the event. Denise Walton is an organic Pasture for Life certified livestock farmer from Peelham Farm in Berwickshire. She's also the chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network in Scotland. Matt Griffin is the farm manager at Neidpath Farm in the Scottish Borders, and he's also a member of the NFFN Scotland Steering Group. And David McKay is the co-director of the Soil Association Scotland. Welcome all. Denise, this was the first Nature Friendly Farming Summit in Scotland. Who came to the event and how did it go?
Well, first of all, the first thing is there was tremendous energy. It was, from what we gathered, after a huge success. You know, when you're very involved in an event, it's sometimes quite difficult to lift your head off the grindstone and realise actually what's happening. We had an astonishing turn up. We sold all the places. All the places went within 2 weeks of the event being publicised. We had a wonderful cross-section of farmers. About a 30% of the audience were farmers, including young farmers from Scottish Rural College. We had policymakers, including our Minister for Agriculture and Rural Connectivity, Jim Fairley, which was very, very encouraging. We had environmental NGOs, we had farming and crofting organisations, researchers, including James Hutton Institute. We had the Scottish Food Commission, Quality Meat Scotland, National Farmers Union for Scotland representatives. Also, we had Farm Strong, and which was really encouraging, and just a really significant assembly of experts, movers and shakers in the sort of Scottish farming, crofting and land management arena, if you like. So it was very encouraging, the turnout that we had.
It sounds like you really landed with a bang, considering this was the first summit of its kind in Scotland.
Yeah, I think it's a representative need as well. I mean, I was commenting with people, delegates at the summit, that quite possibly had the same subject been presented, say, 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had the same take up. But obviously, we're a new organisation. We're an organisation of farmers and growers for farming and growing. So we're kind of new on the block of policy influence. But somehow there's a much kind of greater knowledge, greater awakening, greater awareness of the fact that we are in a crisis, and we needed to up the game on crisis by calling it a summit. And actually, we did have some pushback from some organisations as to why we were calling it a summit. And we refused to stand down and say it's a summit because actually our industry and society is in a crisis. So yeah, it landed on many open minds.
Matt, from a farmer's perspective, what were the most important moments of the event for you?
I think for me, it really resonated the fact that there was an emphasis on collaboration and knowledge sharing. We heard discussions and feedback from farmers and producers, and how excellent they are at sharing their story with fellow growers and farmers and crofters. For me, these events always are about the networking, and actually very often I was lucky enough to be doing a small talk myself, and as a talker, people do approach you, and at the coffee times and lunch times, that interaction and network is very powerful. And I've had 1 or 2 follow-ups already from Tuesday, which is really exciting.
And in terms of that networking, who is it that you want to network with? Is it people within government that you want to sort of say to them, you know, we need this from you? Or is it other farmers where that knowledge sharing perhaps is more important?
Yeah, both. That's the power of NFFN, is that we're sharing the story of people doing great things to other farmers and crofters and celebrating that. helping steer and navigate through those challenges. And also there's people within the organisation that are really good at pushing on the policy and hoping for better future for farmers and crofters there too.
And in terms of that session that you mentioned that you were taking part of, what were the sort of one or two main messages that you were wanting to get across?
I think for me, I was in a session talking about transition, so transitioning from maybe a conventional sort of mindset to a more nature-based mindset. And I just wanted to get across that actually it's not that easy, and we do need support from government, and we do need support from knowledge sharing networks like the NFFN.
And David, do you think that the event helped to move the policy conversation forward at all?
Yeah, I think it's happened at a really crucial time. You know, we're a little over 6 months out from the next Scottish Parliament elections, which will be in May 2026, and all the political parties are preparing their manifestos. And I think the discussions covered some of the key questions for food and farming policy here in Scotland. You know, are we going in the right direction? Are we moving quickly enough? And if not, what do we need to do differently? What needs to change? I think, as Denise said, the event brought together a really wide-ranging audience, lots of farmers, academics, NGOs, industry bodies, government officials, and the civil servants were there, as well as the Agriculture Minister, Mr. Fairley. So it did feel, really important in helping to move that conversation forward. Yeah.
If we were having this conversation south of the border, and I asked you about the key threats to nature in to nature in England, then I think that probably a lot of farmers would say the government itself was a threat at the moment, along with things like, extreme weather and the way that the different species are being forced into different directions away from their niches. In terms of Scotland, what are the key threats to nature there?
Well, data released recently by Scottish Environment Link shows that almost half Scotland's species have decreased in number since the 1970s, and 1 in 9 is at risk of extinction here. So we know nature is under threat here in Scotland. And I think that the reasons for that decline are complex, but we do know that one of the many drivers for nature loss over the years has been agriculture. And there's strong evidence, for example, that the overuse of pesticides is contributing to that biodiversity loss. But I think that the good news is that nature, has an amazing capacity for resilience and recovery. And I think our farmers and crofters, as we heard on Tuesday, have a really important role to play in making sure that happens.
What about climate change? How is that impacting things? Because it's not just biodiversity loss, is it? In terms of, that sort of loss of species. And you were talking about agriculture there. What are the Scottish soils like?
I think that climate's a big issue, and what we're starting to see, I think we're already seeing, is the impacts of that changing climate. So we're seeing more extremes of weather. Certain times of year there's more storms. When it rains, it's really raining significantly, and I think there's risk there in terms of Scotland's soils, and you can see this as you drive around certain parts of the country at certain times of year where there's bare soil on fields, and if there's been a few days of a real deluge of heavy rain, then that soil's all across the roads and running off the fields. And I can remember going through Angus after Storm Babbitt, which was a particularly bad one, lots of flooding in and around Brecon, and driving along those roads past farms, there was mud all over the roads. So that's a big issue that that needs to be addressed. And there's many things, as you've talked about in your podcast before, that farmers and land managers can be doing to avoid that bare soil and prevent runoff.
Yeah, of course, as you say, as soon as there's mud on the road, for people driving along, that's a nuisance and it's dangerous. But from a farmer's perspective, that's their topsoil. That's one of their sort of key virtues that's being washed away. Now, Denise, when we're thinking about nature, there are obviously lots of good reasons to value nature, for its own sake. But why should Scottish farmers integrate nature on their farms? What are the key opportunities for farmers?
Well, so the big thing is actually working with what nature is giving us freely. I mean, as farmers, we like a freebie. So nature is giving us a lot for nothing. So if we start with the big hitters of why we should be working with nature and what the opportunities are, we are soil managers. The soil is, the biggest carbon store on the planet. So from a global perspective, that's a very important reason to work with our soils. Soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, creating and managing a soil organic sponge means that actually it's on our individual farmers. We're managing water in drought sessions, and we're managing the slowing of water in flood sessions. And in the UK, we're getting extremes of both. So there immediately is both the reason why and an opportunity. And another big hitter is that in terms of sunlight energy, farmers have got the control of the most sophisticated energy converter on the planet, which is photosynthesis and green grass and plants. So we manage that, and that is a huge reason to and huge opportunity in there. And then the other thing is that actually, in terms of grass, again, this is both the reason why we need to work with nature and the big opportunity is that in plants and grass in particular, we've got the planet's largest global coolant with evapotranspiration from the grass that we manage, as long as we're not piling on the oxidizing effects of agrochemicals, we're reducing the planet's surface, and cooling is a huge issue by between 8 and 12 degrees because of evapotranspiration. So we have, as farmers, we walk out our back doors, and that's what we have at our fingertips and at our feet. And then all of those function together, sophisticated functions that nature's been doing long before we appeared on the planet, is biodiversity. This is not about bioabundance. This is an abundance of biodiversity, which is the sophisticated knitting together of those essential functions that farmers actually are part of and have a lot of control, management control of. And then the other hugely important thing, and I mention this because actually today is World Mental Health Day, is that there's increasing documented evidence that farmers who work with nature actually get improved levels of sense of well-being and purpose. So those are some of the many reasons why we should work with nature, and there are opportunities in every one of those.
I love the way that you framed that around freebies, that, there is such a high level of cost to an awful lot of the often chemical-based inputs that farmers put onto their land. But when you're thinking about those freebies, you're thinking about the energy that comes from the sun, about being able to hold the water that comes from the sky, in that landscape in there, so that, when it is hot, when there are droughts, you're still able to produce that grass or whatever else it is you're trying to produce as well. And in terms of Scotland, I mean, a lot of people will associate Scotland, if they know Scotland, at all from elsewhere around the world, they'll associate it with rain. But that's true in the west. It's less true in the east, isn't it, where it's sort of a bit colder and much sunnier. But it is about maximizing your land so that you're able to take advantage of both the sunlight, if, as and when it comes, and the rain. Make sure that you're able to hold it and get rid of it if there's too much of it in a kind of measured way.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, so where we farm in southeast Berwickshire, it's actually this year has been, we've had some of the hottest, driest weather on the east coast of Scotland. But I know we're going to be talking about it later, but we've managed our soil organic matter and soil organic content to the extent that I think it was 2 years ago, we had that extremely hot summer. I popped into my neighbour's recently. Well, it wasn't recently. It was a stubble field with no green. I probed it with an actual soil temperature probe, and the soil temperature within 3 inches was 36 degrees. So I then climbed the hill up to the top of our farm, probed on the same day within an hour into a wonderful sward of white clover and grass, and it was 19 degrees. So we've got almost a doubling of temperature within literally half a kilometre. So
why is that important, Denise?
Well, that's very important because, first of all, you get much better soil functioning where you have cool, moist conditions. Where you have hot, dry conditions, all the sensible invertebrates and earthworms, they bury themselves as deep as possible into the soil profile to get away from the heat and the dry. And also going back to one of the big hitting benefits of integrating with nature, we have the cooling effect of grass. And also you've got photosynthesis. So, having bare stubble and bare soil is actually making it's increasing the vulnerability and the fragility of the very essence and material that we need to function and grow food with.
Now, we're talking here, I guess, about the benefits of nature-friendly farming, David. And in England, we're seeing a substantial threat to nature-friendly farming through the end of the Countryside Stewardship Scheme without a replacement to set up to continue the good work that farmers have been delivering over the last 5 years of the scheme. Now, in discussions that we've been having around the end of Countryside Stewardship, there's a sense that farming for nature comes with a very direct set of costs, and that short-term cash flow may therefore force farmers to plough up margins and abandon other habitat projects. Should Scottish farmers see nature-friendly farming as a cost or a benefit?
I think ultimately it should absolutely be seen as a benefit. Many farmers in Scotland, and I'm sure Denise and Matt can talk to this, are finding that adopting nature-friendly farming practices is reducing costs. Denise already mentioned input costs, for example, and is then improving the profitability of the farm. And it's not just the individual farm, but we all benefit in the longer term from building that resilience into food production systems. But as you say, there's no question that there are costs attached. And it's one of the reasons why for the past 30 years we've had payments for organic conversion and maintenance, because we know that shifting from a kind of chemical heavy agricultural approach to organic requires a transition period, and there can be costs within that. So I think that it's one of the reasons why we're talking to the Scottish Government so much about how they use public funding for agriculture and making sure that some of those cliff edges that we've seen in England don't happen up here.
It's always interesting, isn't it? Because one of the, I hear some policymakers talking about the way in which, it's important to move from an acreage-based payment system, as we have in England, to something where people are paying for public goods, but the farmers shouldn't just be paid to do what they ought to be doing as human beings sort of existing in the world, that they shouldn't be paid not to pollute. But at the same time, there is a need, isn't there, for government to recognise that it has been directing farming to work in particular ways over the last decades, and therefore if that transition is going to take place away from chemical agriculture towards an agriculture where nature is sort of fully embedded, it's providing that resilience, there is a cost to that, and the government should be part of that. Ultimately though, who do you think should be paying for nature-friendly farming, paying for that transition? Is it the farmer? Is it the government? Who should pay?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Finland. I think it links directly to some of what we heard during the sessions at the summit on Tuesday. For me and for the Soil Association perspective, that there has to be a role for both public and the private sector. The Scottish Government right now is providing about £600 million a year in support for agriculture, and ministers have been very clear that they want to use that funding to deliver a transition to sustainable and regenerative farming, as they've put it. Now, we can argue whether or not the current allocation of funding is actually doing that, and I don't think that it is, but there's certainly a broad agreement that there is a role there for government, because we all know that nature-friendly farming will help to deliver on multiple public policy objectives, for example, around climate and nature. Now, there's also a strong case to be made for private sector investment, and there's lots of conversations going on about the best vehicle for that, and making sure that we've got good enough baselining, data collection, monitoring, verification of outcomes, so to make sure that any investment that is coming from that side is making a genuine difference.
And when you talk about private sector investment, I guess the uninitiated could sort of think about that as being investment in food production, investment in technologies and that sort of thing. I'm not sure that's necessarily what you're talking about. Are you talking more about the sort of the nature elements, the carbon value, the biodiversity value?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we'll probably talk about this as we go on, but we're starting to see increasing signs that there is that private investment coming in, and it might be through supply chain companies, it might be through utility companies, it might be through the banks, but we're starting to see in lots of different spaces here in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK that is now happening.
So it's investment in nature and in farm practice rather than in the products, in the sort of private marketable products that are coming from farms in terms of food and fibre. What about the customer though? I mean, presumably they should pay for this partly as well.
I think there's a big debate at the moment, and we hear a lot about this from the organic side in terms of the cost of some organic food versus some of the conventionally or more intensively produced food. And I think there's a big gap here in terms of the true cost of food production and some of the production systems that we have that are delivering at the retail point a very low price. For example, chicken that's coming from an intensive poultry unit, that price is not taking into account the environmental cost of that production system, and it's not taking into account other impacts such as animal welfare outcomes and animal health outcomes. So I think we need to be having a much more kind of grown-up conversation about the true cost of food production from different systems.
Matt, I wonder, in terms of your own farm business and more broadly, farm businesses around you, how can nature-friendly farming help to build resilience into those businesses?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's a word that gets bounded about a lot, and it's sort of up on our whiteboards in our sheds is the resilience words. I mean, fundamentally, it's about building long-term resilience into our business, both ecologically and economically. So it's not just about the good feel factor; it's about real smart business. Soil health and wealth is sort of how we sort of phrase it, because when you get that biology and carbon in your soil, investing into that long-term future, it builds that resilience in. And we talk about the water side of things a lot, and we live right next to an iconic river, the River Tweed. There's a lot of money being spent on flood defences, and if we just think about that simply, because the carbon and the methane is quite a complicated story, whereas the water is quite a simple story. And we have children on farm and we have adults on farm, and the water thing is simple for both of them to understand. And if you've got poor water infiltration, then not only are you going to increase flash flooding, increase water events, you're also losing soil, you're losing nutrients that we can't keep coming back onto the farm. So we think about it in terms of the resilience around the water system, and then everything sort of flows back from there.
You said that resilience was a word that was, sort of up in lots of farmers' sheds. It's a buzzword. To you, what does it mean? How would you define resilience?
So the way we are operating is that because our input costs have been reduced, so we're resilient against an increase in fertilizer costs because we're not buying it. We're resilient against feed costs because we're not buying it. We're resilient against fuel because we're not buying a lot of it. We're resilient, like Denise says, if we get long periods of dry and we've got good soil cover, the soil is armoured and we're keeping it moist, our grass stays green and keeps growing. So we're resilient that way. So we're resilient against the climate. We're resilient against markets because we don't have a high input, high output treadmill system that relies on, the beef price and the sheep price staying where it is. And in terms of our resilience around support from government and stuff, we're trying to build it so that we can use that money to help secure our future by investing it into things like infrastructure and corners for nature, so that the whole holistic sort of thinking of a resilient business just keeps driving forward.
So I guess part of it, just sort of picking up on some of the things that you said, is partly about reducing those dependencies. So it's reducing the costs of things that you have to sort of pay on an annual basis, but also reducing that vulnerability to global shocks where, as we've seen in the past, petrochemical prices as a result of the Ukraine war and other trends around the world has been able to, peaks and troughs, and can make a huge difference. You can suddenly add within the space of 2 or 3 weeks, 50 grand to a farm sort of pesticide or
Exactly.
fertilizer bill. So it's about addressing some of those things, taking those things out so that your farm can function no matter what else is going on in the world.
Yeah. I'm not naive to think that we've got it all right and that we're not still exposed to hiccups. But also there's the resilience in the people in the business. We don't I've got neighbours that are already into a winter feeding regime where they're scraping cows out and bedding cows down and feeding silage and starting the tractor every morning. We don't have that. If my guys want a lazy start on a weekend, that's fine. If they've got to go and see the kids play on a Tuesday morning, that's fine. We can work around that. With the business has got resilience that allows people to get off farm and have a good sort of work-life balance.
Yeah. And of course, as you say, there's a difference to being able to cope with the odd hiccup to having some sort of chronic coughing, the disease that's sort of taking place there. So it's reducing that risk, and that's really interesting. Thank you, David. How does Scottish policy landscape support nature-friendly farming? Because of course, Scotland has its own government; it is unique, and so policy there is different from Wales or England or Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so I think at a high level, as I mentioned earlier, the Scottish Government has set out its stall in terms of that transition that it wants to see to sustainable and regenerative farming. As things stand, however, the bulk of that agricultural budget is not directly supporting nature-friendly farming. If you look at allocations of basic payment scheme payments, for example, you mentioned this earlier, they're based on the area of land farmed rather than any particular practice or outcomes that are happening. And 70% of the current overall budget is spent on those direct payments. Now, there is a percentage within that that's going to greening, but all the research that I've seen on that shows that greening has actually had a pretty limited impact in terms of delivery of those environmental outcomes. And after that, only 5% of the budget is going to agri-environment schemes, for example, which actually have a direct impact in terms of encouraging nature or restoring nature on farms.
I think sort of taking a slightly quite a sort of positive view of what's happening in Scotland, because I think, for me, within the policy world in England, looking to Scotland, there is a degree to which I'm looking quite jealously at some of the stuff that's going on there. I've always been of the opinion that every acre can be improved, every acre needs to be improved, and therefore there is an argument for a continuation to an extent of acreage payments. The question is what you're being expected to do for those payments, and part of what you're doing up there is the whole farm plan. And I wonder if you could just comment a bit about those whole farm plans and the sort of baselining that's going on, because surely that baselining is going to be critical in terms of that greening portion going forward, and increasing the expectations that if you've got strong baselines, what farmers are doing, you can help to enhance that greening mechanism going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we the Soil Association have been talking about for quite a while now, the importance of that baselining and monitoring and figuring out where we are across the country. The whole farm plan requirement quickly is something that's come in on BPS, came in spring this year, and essentially it's a series of tests and audits, so soil test, carbon audit, biodiversity audit, an animal health and welfare plan, and integrated pest management plan. Those, at the moment, those are options, so you only have to do 2 in order to get the payment this year, but over time that will be ratcheted up and everybody will have to do all that are applicable to their farm. And we talked to Scottish Government and negotiated kind of opt-outs for organic farmers for the whole farm plan, because they already produce, for example, livestock management plans and crop management plans that are considered equivalent to some of those. But I think the benefit of that is that you're starting then to build up a picture of what's actually happening in terms of carbon and biodiversity in soils on farm. I think the challenge for government is that the data is not being collected. So you don't have to submit results or your soil analysis, for example, in order to receive the payment. You just have to tick the box and you get your BPS payment. So I think there's a missed opportunity there where we're actively encouraging everybody to go out and do this testing, but we're not gathering it together and learning from it at that regional and national level, which I think would be quite important to inform future policy.
That seems fascinating. I had been under the complete assumption that government was going to be receiving that data. Why aren't they? And do you think that will change in the future?
We certainly hope that it will. And I think my understanding, and this may be not be correct, is that they don't have a data platform, so the kind of IT infrastructure, if you like, that would be required to collect that data. And there's also going to be an issue, I imagine, once you start that conversation, that farmers might want to hold on to that data. So why are we giving it over to the government? So I think there's some obstacles to deal with there. But for us, from our point of view, this is such a crucial part of the transition that we're trying to see, is that we need to know what's happening at an individual farm level so that any progress can be monitored. And then, as I mentioned, that can help inform future policy by ensuring that the funding that we do have, and it's likely that funding overall is probably going to decrease, if anything, in the coming years, that it's as targeted as possible, because at the moment, there's still far too much of that budget that is going to farmers who are not doing very much, and certainly to the biggest landowners on some of the best land. And I think there's a more equitable way that we could distribute the payments to get better bang for our buck, I think.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The way that people are often just entirely happy to give vast amounts of data to Apple or to Facebook or to private companies that they seem to trust more than the government to handle that data. And of course, when you're talking about Apple, you're paying them for the pleasure of having that phone and that contract and giving them the data. Whereas if the government would receive the data, they'd be using that as a basis for paying you. It's a fascinating sort of element of the human condition, isn't it? I just wonder, Denise, what, from your perspective, are the key funding mechanisms that nature-friendly farmers can benefit from in Scotland, over and above the basic payment scheme? What else is there that they can benefit from, and particular grants as well?
So that's the biggest funding mechanism is the Agri Environment and Climate Scheme, EECS, and this is sort of a points-based system. And actually, the minister at our summit announced that they've committed to extending it to 2030. So it's there's some quite, it's given something like 340 million since it started in 2015, and it covers more than 20% of farmed land in Scotland has some EECS activity on it. So it's its objectives are ambitious, but it's not enough money to kind of achieve the scale that we need for the change. And I think actually one of the greatest achievements of EECS is organic conversion and also maintenance. Mm-hmm. So the encouragement of farmers to go organic and to be maintained in organic, that is a very big and constructive achievement. So that's specifically for farmers who've got business registration numbers, established and registered farm holdings. But there is also, and it's only just closed, the Nature Restoration Fund, which is open to all land managers, including NGOs who manage land, and it's open to farmers. But this is for large scale habitat improvement or creation. And, farmers, including ourselves, actually, we collaborated with 3 other farmers to make a fairly large scale change with the Nature Restoration Fund, which was fantastic. But these are capital grants, so we were always giving our own time. And more recently, this year, we had our first round of the Future Farming Investment Scheme, which is capital only. And for this year, it was 14 million. The government wanted it to be a multi-year scheme and have committed something like 60 million to it. It was very heavily oversubscribed. And admittedly, it was an early, it's the first round of the scheme. And we did notice as the scheme progressed that the government sort of made little changes to some of the rules and regulations, including putting a cap on hedgerows, which caused some farmers who'd made an application to have to go back and reapply. But also, the government have listened to us and made that a very simple scheme to apply for, which was, I mean, as a farming business, we applied for it, which made it, it was really refreshing to apply simply for capital funding. So there's the EECS and FFIS are the main sort of funding mechanisms, but obviously not enough. But just a wee point, it's encouraging too that the FFIS, it's called the Future Farming Investment Scheme, that government are now terming the contribution to farming for nature as an investment. We're no longer the kind of recipients of support. So there is this move away from support as a crutch to investment to encourage us to change. But again, just to emphasize, not enough to make the meaningful change.
So again, that investment idea is sort of public funding for public goods. It's recognizing that the money that's going to farmers is it's not a subsidy coming from government. It's not like people getting a welfare check. It is investment in change to one extent or another. Matt, we talked about resilience before, and I just want to come back to you to talk about what would you think are the key obstacles to scaling nature-friendly farming in Scotland?
Sorry, my mic was off. I think the obvious one is money. It's having cash flow issues through that transition period, and we've experienced that because we had to destock a little bit before we looked to bring the stock numbers back up so we could create rest in the system. Infrastructure, there's a cost around putting infrastructure in, so lots of fencing, lots of water. We need to implement mob grazing. We need movable water. We need lots of paddocks, and that's so. It's not only the cost of that; it's the knowledge of that, and knowing which types of fittings and which troughs to use and which type of wire to use, etc., etc. And some of that we've learned the hard way. Navigating around some of the schemes, that's another obstacle. So sometimes some of the grazing that you might want to implement don't always sort of marry up with the way that the schemes are designed. And then probably the other one is, we've touched on it this morning, is the mental health. And Doug Avery came over a few years ago into Scotland to talk about resilience as a farmer, and he said we spend all the time talking about the paddocks and how we manage the paddocks. Well, actually the hardest paddock to manage on the farm is the top paddock, and that really resonates with me. And that's a key obstacle is people's headspace. So having the headspace to be able to implement change, but also having the support, because currently if you're a conventional farmer and you're buying feed and you're buying fertilizer and you're buying fuel, all of those reps that bring you a calendar and a bottle of wine at Christmas are patting you on the back, having a cup of tea with you a couple of times a year. That is your support network. If we're asking farmers to move away from that conventional system, you don't only push those inputs away, you push those people that come on your farms away, and they're the people that put their arm around you and say, it's all right, I've got another fix for your next disaster here. And we need constant support for people going through change, because it is a massive challenge.
I just want to pick you up on that, because I think it's a fascinating element, and not one that we've talked about probably enough on this podcast. The idea of the highest paddock, the mind, and how you cope with change. So you're talking there about the kind of the conventional network of people who come and have a cup of tea, come and have a cup of coffee, and talk through the problems, try and help them provide solutions. If we were if we were 10, 20 years ago and you were trying to make changes on your farm and you were isolated and everybody around you was still farming in a conventional way, that would be really quite difficult. Today, it seems that new networks have emerged. And I just wonder if you could talk to me about some of those new networks and where that peer support comes from.
Yeah, so that I'm in some fascinating sort of groups and networks and WhatsApps that are really, really supportive and very, very open. And you do find that when you're in this sort of space that people talk about where things go, quite to plan, and help people make sure that they don't make that same mistake. I do a lot of work with SRUC. I do a little bit of work with the Royal
Scotland's Rural College.
Yeah, and I do a bit with the Royal Dick School, veterinary school. And, I think there's still an element of divide between the sort of conventional thinking and the nature-based farming. And it is slowly starting to intertwine. But and we had 10 students at the summit on Tuesday from SRUC, which was great to see. But when for me in my 40s, it's easy for me to sort of take it on the chin a bit. When I've got young staff, if I've got one of my young staff goes to the rugby club or goes to the young farmers, and they're the sort of one that's working for the nature friendly guy, everybody needs the support. So it's not just about me, it's about my staff, and it's about everybody within the industry. And I think we are getting a lot better at it, definitely. But I think we can still do a lot better.
It sounds like the sort of peer support in terms of mental well-being actually is not dissimilar from the peer support around knowledge exchange. And it's always struck me that farmers are really good at looking over the fence at what's going on next door and seeing if they can sort of emulate or learn something from it. And over the last decade or so, I think the nature-friendly farming, organics and regenerative have become really very good at exchanging knowledge. And within that is that sort of, well-being support as well. And as you say, you've got WhatsApps and things like podcasts and so on for knowledge sharing, but also those sort of farm visits, the opportunity for people to come and actually see for themselves seems to be very important.
Yeah, and we Denise has already mentioned this morning, we got Farmstrong doing an amazing job in Scotland, bringing people to see all sorts of systems, and it brings people around a cup of tea or a coffee to chat. And it can be quite a lonely place, and farmers need time. That's probably one of the obstacles is time, not having enough time to get off farm, to come to summits, to go to talks, to go to visits, to listen to podcasts, etc.
Denise, I just wonder if we could move on, from the farm to the market, and if you have a sense of how the market works to encourage or discourage nature-friendly farming.
Well, the national multiple retail controlled market doesn't encourage nature-friendly farming. And arguably, you could argue that it's against their interests to encourage it. And perhaps this is a discussion for another day. But the relocalized markets are. So when I see relocalized farmers markets, direct selling online, and also there are a growing number of small ethical retail distributors who also support the production of food from nature-friendly farming. But generally, nature-friendly farming is not embedded in the food we produce. And of course, one of the big issues is that, food at scale is underpriced, undervalued. And, arguably that's in the interests of the multiple retailers and the purveyors of large scale machinery, seed, etc. So the market, the large scale market, which we absolutely have got to change to make the scales difference, does not and is not encouraging nature-friendly farming. And where it says it does, I don't like to use the word, maybe I should use the word nature wash. I think it's a little bit of nature washing going on. But then let's look at let's be positive. At least nature washing is changing the narrative. So, regenerative farming, the narrative has changed. We now have a regenerative farming national award alongside Arable Farmers Award. So, the narrative is changing. And we do at least have the Advertising Standards Agency sort of standing up for the term regenerative farming. So we are moving there, and there's some very good indicators, but it's the scale and it's the timeliness of it.
I always feel that, as you've sort of indicated there, that greenwashing or nature washing, as you said, is at least an acknowledgement that the public are interested in this. It is the start of a journey, even if, ultimately it's not getting us, quickly enough to where we need to be. But if I think about, the retail opportunities that exist at the moment. If I go to Tesco, then I'm buying food. If I go to Waitrose, I'm buying food plus a bit of an idea of something that's sort of nebulously farmed in a better way. But then what you're talking about in terms of those more independent networks is that people aren't just buying food; they're buying into an idea, into an ideology, into a set of outcomes that farmers are presenting in one way or another. So in terms of your own experience, Denise, how have you managed to scale your own approach to nature at Peelham Farm and to make that attractive at a sensible price to the people who come and buy your produce?
Well, I'll come to that directly, but if I could just make one comment that, when national polls have been done, and in particular the very admirable Food and Farm and Countryside Commission's National Food Conversation, we know that people across the board of different income backgrounds, different demographies, different ethnicities want access to good food that supports farmers and nature. So this is what people want, but the multiple retailers need to be held more to account for what they're putting on their shelves. And it shouldn't just be accessible to the higher income earners of Waitrose and Ocado and all the rest. It needs to be across the board. So that's how that got. Just in terms of for how we scale up. So my husband and I were new entrant smallholders in 1989. So, so we've been here farming for a while, and we've had the opportunity, more by default than design, to increase the area of land that we farm, so that our son now is in farm with us. Nature has always had a place at our table. Every discussion about change and infrastructure, nature has come into that. And I mean, my background is in field ecology. So I was earning money as a field ecologist as we built the farm. And so nature's always been there. So there's always been that intention, the very determined intention. But we've also, because we could never ever have earned the money or generated the income to improve the habitat infrastructure of the farm, which was very depleted when we took it on, is we've taken advantage of every single capital grant fund that's been made available by government. So we've scaled up thanks to government support, and one of our visions was always, funny enough, ironically, to get away from farm subsidies, was to supply direct. So we haven't got away from farm subsidies, obviously. So we supply direct, but the food that we supply reflects more the cost of production than the equivalent. And I won't say equivalent in terms of nutrient density or, nature-friendly farming embedded in it, is bound to be more expensive because it costs a wee bit more. But then having said that, when we custom face directly hundreds every week at farmers markets, we do 12 to 14 across Scotland, and we're online directly with our customers, is that we notice in the last 25 years of doing farmers markets that, again, the demography has changed. We have single mums with kids who might just come and buy one bit of meat a month, but that's fine. Or so we're busier with smaller purchases, but we're fine with that because people are buying more of the good stuff and better. So that's how we've scaled up for three reasons. First of all, nature's always been at our table. Secondly, we've had government infrastructure support for capital improvement. And thirdly, we've customer faced directly over the farmers market stall, customers who've wanted us to change. We always were going to go organic, but the customers gave us the conviction to change. So the customers have also led us there, and not just, your the professional academic who dominated our first market, say, for example, at Edinburgh Castle Terrace, but right across the board. Now people are wanting what we do.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. Now, David, we're going to do a separate programme on natural capital in Scotland and how that sort of impacts on the market and on the way that farms are used. But I wonder if you could just sort of dip into this for me a bit now. So natural capital markets can, of course, stack or separate land uses. How do you feel that natural capital markets are helping to balance nature delivery with food and fibre production in Scotland?
So in Scotland, my colleagues on the certification side of the Soil Association Group have been involved, for the last several years now in verifying quite a lot of projects under the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland codes. We've seen quite a bit of that in recent years. We're starting to see some other examples popping up of investment in natural capital, but we don't yet have, say, for example, you have in England right now, you've got biodiversity net gain. We don't have that in Scotland yet. I think we will have something similar, and it probably will be called something else, but at the moment we don't. So I think in some respects, we're still kind of at the foothills of what might be possible and what might be coming in the future, and that potential quite significant private investment in nature-based solutions, for example, which has been talked about for quite a long time. But I was down in England a month ago at an organic farm in the southwest that had, really capitalized on BNG and biodiversity net gain, and really some fantastic, riparian tree planting, various different projects that happened. And so I think there's potential for that to happen up here as well. But I think we're slightly behind in that respect, and from what you're seeing, certainly in England at the moment.
And Matt, have you managed to benefit at all from nature markets at Neidpath Farms?
No, not directly yet, but we are in some really, really exciting conversations with a couple of different sort of private companies about some opportunities going forward. And one really exciting about another block that we've been asked to manage. And the beauty of that is that we've got some really good baselines at the start, and they're really excited to be part of it, using a sort of a butterfly conservation sort of charity as sort of the one that's going to navigate us through it. And I think it's really exciting, and I think it's it's quite a big conversation at the moment. There's a lot of people sort of just sitting on the hands trying to work out when to press go. But all the conversations we've had so far have been so positive.
Really interesting. Now, David, we're coming towards the end of the programme, but I just want to ask you this about Scotland's landscapes, particularly as you travel further north. They get much bigger than landscapes are really in the rest of Britain. They feel much bigger. Are there good examples of landscape scale programmes that support farming integrated with nature delivery?
Well, yeah, we actually heard a really interesting presentation at the summit on Tuesday from the guys at Landscape Environment Network, and the work that they're doing. They talked about the work they're doing on the River Leven catchment area in Scotland, and also the River Spey, and there was a third one which will escape me, but it was really interesting to hear what they're doing. They've brought together a lot of different organisations. So for example, in the Leven area, it's the Forth Rivers Trust, Nature Scot, Heritage Lottery Fund, the local council, Perth and Kinross Council was involved, and they're working with local farmers and land managers to deliver, I guess, on a range of outcomes in terms of things like improving water quality, resilience of crop production, mitigating flood risk, protecting nature more generally. And from what I heard during the presentation, some of the farmers, it was a small group of farmers, I think about 10, but they are receiving already some pretty good payments per hectare as part of that scheme, and by the sounds of things, they're expanding that, as I said, into other catchments in Scotland. So I think that sounds like a good example of what you've described there, that kind of landscape scale. And the key point I took away from that presentation was the importance of collaboration. So it was all these different groups with slightly different interests, and there were utility companies involved and other private sector companies involved. And bringing them together, facilitating those conversations, and making positive things happen. So I think we're likely to see more of that in the future.
Yeah, I think, as you say, those riverbank schemes are really interesting. Great opportunities for sort of public and private investment happening there, where there's a really sort of sizable job of work, isn't there, to try and sort of recreate the woodland around the riverbanks in order to reduce nutrient runoff, increase shelter, increase biodiversity, as well as then sort of holding additional carbon. I mean, they're really important projects just in general. Matt, just before we kind of come to a close, what would you say? Because we've talked about customers, we've talked about the markets a little bit at various different points in the program. What would you say are the key outcomes or messages around nature-friendly farming that you think best resonate with customers?
It's a really interesting one, because if you'd have asked me that a while ago, I would have thought of my customers as the people that are buying my meat and fibre, and we do have the conversations with those. But when we have more and more public people on sort of farm tours, we're starting to realise that actually our customers are the ones that are walking in and around our farm. The customers are the people that are experiencing flooding further down, and our customers are the ones that are swimming in the river right next to the farm. So all of the positive stuff that we do when we think about nature-based farming, it affects all of those types of incomes, those types of streams in terms of customers, not just meat and fibre. People like Denise are doing a really good job and have a great backstory about selling meat. We've got some interesting conversations going on about our wool. But yeah, it's really sort of blown me away how people are really interested in how the water leaves our farm into a river that the kids all swim in half a cade, downstream on a hot summer's day in Peebles.
Fantastic. Now, we came into the programme talking about the Nature Friendly Farming Summit and the Nature Friendly Farming Network in Scotland. And Denise, I wonder if you could just take us out in a similar way. What's next for the NFFN in Scotland?
Well, as we need to kind of absorb and distill what we've learnt at the summit. And we've learnt so much from all of our peers and contributors and experts. So we need time to absorb all of that. But I think if we were to take 2 or 3 big messages, the big realization is that to make the change, we have to do it at scale. So scale means collaboration, collective working. So my sense is, and this is discussion I'll be having with my colleagues in the NFFN and our Scottish steering group, is how do we collaborate collectively to make the scale difference? So scale, collaboration, collective working, knowledge sharing, peer-to-peer, these are all the important things that we know complementary supporting organizations also want to see. So, we'll be part of a wave or network of collective working to make the scale difference and as quickly as possible.
Fantastic. I love that idea of a positive wave taking over Scotland in terms of nature-friendly farming. Well, look, that's it. That's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank my guests, David McKay, Matt Griffin and Denise Walton. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us and share our links. Farmgate is now the world's highest-ranking food security podcast, and Farmgate leaders Martin's Farm and Wheat from the Chaff are all available on your Farmgate channel if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.